Okay, today we begin looking at Islam, and this is just a very brief introduction to Islam, but we are going to spend a fair amount of time on this topic, largely because it's one of the most misunderstood due to modern political opinions. You think about ISIS, and people who are ignorant of Islam project that onto all of Islam. So we will spend a fair amount of time on this in order so that we understand the basic core concepts of Islam. We'll understand how it spread, what that meant to those parts of the world. But today we're just going to focus on some very, very basics. So you see the quote right there: Islam was simultaneously both a single world of shared meaning and interaction and a series of separate and distinct communities, often in conflict with one another. This is the unique thing about Islam compared to maybe other religions or other empires around the world. You have every Muslim in the world, regardless of where they live, believing the same thing, having their religion play a key role in their lives, dictating how they live their lives. But at the same time, depending upon where a Muslim lived, they had very different local or regional things that they did that other Muslims did not. Just a quick anecdotal piece of evidence was the famous Muslim explorer Ibn Battuta. He was kind of like the Marco Polo of his time period. And he traveled throughout the world, the known world, especially the Islamic world. And he saw Islam a certain way. He was from a more traditional part of the Islamic world. But when he got to West Africa, where Islam had spread, he was stunned by the unabashed lack of modesty by how they lived, especially the women, as they ran around partially naked, as fornication was considered okay, and in hardly any other part of the Islamic world would this have been okay. But that's an example of how all of those people in West Africa were Muslims, and they turned to Mecca 5 times a day, just like all other Muslims. They followed most other things that Islam taught, but at the same time, their already pre-existing ways of doing things also were part of their lives. And so they still kept those things that other parts of the Islamic world would not have been familiar with. And of course, Ibn Battuta was, just appalled by this, being a more conservative and traditional Muslim. So on this slide here, you can see what I just discussed, the idea of all Muslims having a common commitment to Islam. By the way, Muslim means submitting to the will of God. And again, the idea that the Islamic world, as it spreads, and we're going to see that it spreads pretty far, pretty quickly, was certainly separate and distinct because of the areas that it had spread to. So this shows the first few hundred years of Islam and its spread, and you can see the darker shade of purple, I guess. That was during Muhammad's lifetime, so not very much, but you can see here in the Arabian Peninsula that he manages to unite a significant chunk of what is the world's largest peninsula. And you have here the very beginnings of Islam and the precedent set that Islam can spread quickly. And you see the lighter purple from 632 to 656. In just another generation, it takes over all of what had been the Egyptian Empire, or the Middle East, what had been the Persian Empire, and so on and so forth. And then a little later on, we see the darker blue. It takes over all of North Africa. It gets into Europe, into the Iberian Peninsula, where Portugal and Spain are today, and it expands all the way, not quite into India, but we see that that's pretty much the extent of where a lot of previous empires had made it regarding India, although Islam will eventually expand into India, but that's not until much later. So in less than 300 years, Islam spread much further and much faster than any empire the world had ever seen. And you can see just how much territory they control. And of course, you're kind of like, oh, well, what happened to Europe and so forth? Well, Europe, again, we talked about before, had been fragmented after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, still existed. But as Islam spreads, the Byzantine Empire is going to weaken and shrink over time, and eventually it's going to fall, but not for quite a while longer. Now, that's the early years of Islam, but take a look at this map, where we take a look at the later years during this time period. So the extent of the Islamic world in yellow, up to about 1250, so about to the time of the Mongols, who we'll talk about much later. But you can see they managed to start working their way a little further south in Africa to the eastern parts of Africa. They managed to get into modern-day Turkey, and it even spreads into India later on. And you see the orange up until 1500, and you see West Africa, Central Africa, you see Central Asia and India, also Southeast Asia. So Islam in less than 1,000 years, pretty much has gobbled up all of the major centers of civilization except China and Western Europe. So it's a pretty tremendous thing that they did. And there's a few reasons for that that are worth mentioning. You have the idea of the phrase Islam was spread by the sword. And that was true at times, but Islam didn't always conquer people. A lot of times Islam had such an appealing message to people that so many people in a region converted to it. And so, the region naturally became Islamic as opposed to being conquered by Islamic empires. So, it happens in different ways. Now, I'm not saying that Islamic empires didn't go and kill people and wage wars in order to spread their religion and power, but the fact is that it wasn't always like that. So, some key terms we need to be familiar with so that as we move forward in our study of Islam, these words don't trip you up. So, the relationship between the Quran, Hadiths, Ulama, and Sharia. So, of course, if any of these words make sense to you or you've heard before, it's probably the Quran. And it is the most holy text because there are other holy texts within Islam, but it is the most holy text. It's the equivalent of what the Bible would be to Christianity. And according to the Quran, according to Islam, the Quran is the revelations that had been given to Muhammad, and they eventually, Muhammad, with the help of his wife and daughters, actually compiled the Quran during his lifetime. Now, one thing to remember about the relationship, not just between Christianity and Islam, but also Judaism, is that they're all interrelated. They're all Abrahamic faiths. And the other thing to remember is that Islam saw people of Christian and Jewish faith as what we call people of the book. And so in much of the Islamic world, Christians and Muslims were allowed to freely practice. Christians and Muslims living side by side. Imagine that, without any problems whatsoever for hundreds of years. The other thing to think about regarding the relationship between Christianity and Islam, which we always think are at odds, is that Islam recognizes Jesus of Nazareth as a prophet. They believe he exists. They believe he was one of the prophets, but they don't believe he was the final prophet. And so that's where they begin to differ as far as their historical understanding of God's relationship with man. Now, I'll digress there a little bit, but that was some worthwhile information. The other thing I want to talk about our hadiths, and I think in the Crash Course video, John Green does a good job of pointing out that not all hadiths can be trusted, but these are things that are written down based on oral histories, and are supposed to be considered holy texts and are a source of Islamic law. Now, some hadiths are tremendously important to Muslims, others are kind of considered silly, and so they're not given a lot of credit. Interpreters of religious texts. You have ulamas. These are the religious scholars within the Islamic world. And then you have Sharia law, Islamic law, and the important thing to remember here is it deals with all matters of a person's life, both secular and religious. And so when we think about like a theocratic government today, such as they have in Iran, you have a government that is run by the principles of a religion, and of course it's Islam, and that religion dictates how the government operates and how people can live their lives. And of course that's fundamentally opposed to our Western principles of separation of church and state. Some other concepts to understand: imams. These are leaders within the Islamic world who have high religious authorities, we might say, and they're kind of like the local authority, so to speak. They might have control over their own mosque or their own religious community, and so people in that community would go to their imam for spiritual guidance or questions that needed answered. So a little bit different than the ulama, who is a much smaller community of religious scholars for the Islamic world. Caliphs, these are the representatives of Allah on earth. These are the people that come after Muhammad. And of course, this is where we get the division within the Islamic world between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. Sunni Muslims believe that the caliphs after Muhammad should have been chosen by an election of the people, and Shias believe that the caliph should have been appointed by God, or essentially should have been one of Muhammad's descendants. And so this is what causes the early split within the Islamic world. But the caliph at any given time is the most holy person on earth. You could say that the caliph, in equating it to Christianity, at least Catholicism, is the equivalent of what Catholics would believe the Pope to be, although not quite the same, but still the most holy representative on earth of God. So there's a look at some of the basics of early Islam, and we'll get into the specifics of the Islamic empires, and in your chapter readings, of course, you'll and in some of our classroom activities, we'll read about and try to understand the spice model. We'll understand what social life is like in the Islamic world, how the politics of religion mixed with the different Islamic empires, as well as how this spreads culturally and how it's different in varying parts of the Islamic world. And of course, the economic is going to be really important as well, because Islam, unlike other religions or other parts in the world, actually value merchants. Muhammad himself was a merchant. And so they're not going to be low on the social pyramid within the Islamic world. And that's going to mean that Islam is a religion of trade. Islam is a religion that values being able to become wealthy, so as long as you do it modestly. So as long as you, as a privileged Muslim, help out poor Muslims, so on and so forth. So that's just the basic introduction to Islam. We'll be learning a lot more later on.